Hey guys, this is Mark Howard, author of the Griffin Legends fantasy novel series. Thanks for joining me here. So, we have recently seen a bit of a stir on the internet. Dungeons and Dragons has released some new artwork depicting some orcs, right? And this has caused a bit of controversy here because these orcs are not depicted in stereotypical fashion, right? So instead of seeing these orcs depicted as warriors, raiders, very barbaric looking, instead we see these very peaceful looking, farmers, children, right? They just look like everyday people, right? One's riding a horse with a sombrero. There's nothing inherently evil or barbaric looking about these orcs. And this is, like I said, this is caused a lot of problems in some circles of the internet. And so I wanted to weigh in on this a little bit. And it's before we dive into too much whether orcs should be this or should be that, I want to start by saying, since orcs are made up creatures, right? They're not real. They are not based on anything in real life, at least not in any popular depiction that I've ever seen, right? So, given that they're not based on a real world culture or ethnicity, we can really do whatever we want with them, right? As fantasy creatures here. I know that there have been people in the recent past and still today even who might argue that orcs have served as a stand-in for racist tropes or whatever, right? But I don't see it. I don't see inherent racism in the depiction of orcs. And to be honest, I think it says a lot about you if you do see orcs as a stand-in for a real-world culture or a real-world people, right? Because the way orcs have been traditionally depicted is as these fantasy creatures that can range in physical appearance to these small little goblinoids, to these more hulking, muscular, brutish creatures, right? But their physiology does not have any inherent characteristics that make me think, yes, the Far East or Latin America or Africa, right? There's nothing about an orc's physical description that immediately makes me think of some culture outside of Europe. In fact, to the contrary, based on how orcs are traditionally dressed and the kinds of weapons and armor they're usually shown wielding, you would think that they actually have some sort of European origin, right? Where they wield these weapons and armors that maybe they're a little bit more crude in appearance than some of their contemporary European counterparts, but they don't strike me as being based off of any particular culture outside of something vaguely European here. So anyway, we've got this idea out of the way that orcs are not inherently racist. And so let's talk for a second here about where do orcs come from as a fantasy archetype, how they have been portrayed, and what are the pros and cons of portraying these things in different ways, right? So orcs start with Tolkien, right, with the Lord of the Rings, and they serve a specific narrative purpose, right? The orcs serve as the Dark Lord Sauron's minions, right? They're his evil henchmen that do his bidding to wage war on Middle-earth, which that very basic description has been carried on by other fantasy writers and endures to this day by and large, right? But Tolkien himself went a little deeper than simply the dark monsters that get in the way of the heroes, right? Tolkien described the orcs as tortured and mutilated elves that were turned to the dark powers, right? And so there's a little bit of a tragic backstory to these orcs as they were originally depicted here. And it's something that I want to dive into just a little more here of why have orcs in the first place. And it comes down to orcs are not needed in fantasy, right? You can have an all-human world and it still be in the fantasy genre. I know when I was getting really serious about writing my own fantasy books, I did have a little bit of a debate on what kinds, if any, fantasy creatures I wanted to include. There was a brief period where I was considering an all-human world. There was also on the table the idea of inventing new fantasy races. But in the end, I decided on going with a lot of the more classic tropes for a fantasy setting, including things like elves, orcs, dwarves, goblins, all these kinds of staples that we've seen in fantasy for the better part of a half century, if not more, because each of these different fantasy races doesn't necessarily represent a real life ethnicity out there, but instead they represent overall human characteristics, both good and bad, that can be explored further through melodrama, right? So if I take the classic depiction of orcs, which is most of what this video is about, I'm going to be looking at attributes that lean into a society of might makes right. You know, the orcs, they generally are ill-mannered. They're not afraid to kill to get what they want. Maybe they are a little bit on the cowardly side, depending on the particular iteration of orcs we're looking at. But this is a orcish society, as it's generally portrayed, is not a nice place, right? It's very gruff. It's very mean. You gotta be strong to survive as an orc. And so these are the kinds of characteristics in the whole of humanity that orcs want to explore from a writer's perspective, right? When we look at the flip side of the coin, say elves, right, where elves are very refined, very elegant, that's exploring some different traits there, and not always 100% good, mind you, right? Elves are typically depicted as being a a race more inclined towards good, certainly than orcs. But elves can also, we can use elves to explore elements like haughtiness or aloofness, pride, things that are not always strictly things we really want to emulate in ourselves, right? And likewise, even in a might makes right society, I think there's, on the orc end here, there is still some room to explore the nuances of what makes an orc there. And so I think that when we have these new Dungeons and Dragons artists wanting to depict orcs in a more subtle, more nuanced way, that's not entirely without merit, right? Again, if we've got these peace-loving orcs, it's like, okay, that's you can't call it wrong because again, they're made up in the first place. But I would also contend that if we are going to go down this route of saying that orcs are just like any other group of people, and we have more alike than what we have, than what we don't share, then it leaves me to wonder, why do we need orcs to tell that story, right? If at the end of the day, orcs are no different than you and I, but maybe they've got green skin, pointy ears, and some tusks or something like that going on, then we don't really need orcs to tell that story. And so my big contention here is simply that if we want to have orcs and elves and dwarves and goblins and so on and so forth in our fantasy world, then we've got these well-established tropes, and they're there for a reason because, well, they work, and they have worked for a really long time. And so we can either go down those routes of describing them in these classic ways, or we can do option 2, which is subvert expectations in some ways, right? Our peace-loving orcs here. Or maybe we can take a third option where we look at things in a more nuanced way. And I actually, I wrote a short story about orcs, right? Orcs feature in my fantasy world, as I've said. And when I wrote this story, I didn't want to strictly subvert expectations, right? I think for me, I've consumed a lot of media in my upbringing where it was all about subverting those expectations, right? Take these ideas that we have about orcs and flip them on their head, right? I consumed a lot of media where that has been one of the larger themes in my childhood and early adult years, and I gotta say I'm kind of bored with it, to be honest, right? So when I wrote my short story about an orc, right, where one of these orcs was the main character, I decided that instead I would explore the perspective of a more traditional orc without excusing any of the bad behavior, right? The things that we don't want to see, the crudeness, the rudeness, the willing to stab someone in the back, right? I didn't want to excuse any of that behavior, but I also didn't want to get rid of it. And so this is my short story, Oath Warrior, is a story where we dive deep into that perspective, where the goal is not to vindicate an orc, not to rewrite orcs as being something that they were not traditionally depicted as, but to better understand these orcs for what they have traditionally been depicted as, right? To really get into the mind of the stereotypical orc, which I think in some ways is the greater challenge, right? I mean, it's in some ways almost kind of lazy to say, oh, orcs aren't bad, they're just misunderstood, right? Oh, orcs are just like us at the end of the day. I think that is a kind of story that does have merit, but I also don't think it takes a lot of thought to necessarily pull that story off, right? We can always say that, oh yes, these green-skinned guys with tusks and pointy ears, they're just like us, but they have a different style of clothing and they like a different kind of food than us, right? To me, that seems a little bit lazy, and I think the greater challenge, and in my mind, the story with the greater value, is to try to explore those differences in some depth, and then to draw your own conclusions about said differences. So, anyway, that is my 2 cents on the latest and greatest debate on orcs. As I mentioned, right, you guys are all entitled to your own opinion. At the end of the day, they're fantasy creatures, so, take that for what it's worth. But let me know what you think. Is this a good trend that orcs are being shown in this new light? Or do we like the more traditional approach where orcs kind of represent these chaotic forces that need to be held in check? Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. I really enjoy the feedback that I get on these videos. Thank you guys so much, and we will see you all next time.